Thank you so much. We are very pleased to be here and to be presenting our work to you. I will start sharing screen now. Can you see the screen? Yes, lovely. So welcome to this webinar on school buildings, where we are particularly interested in looking at the role of the spatial layout, the architectural layout, and how it shapes teaching and learning. Thomas Marcus, who is an architectural historian, he wrote a history of school buildings. And in this book, the following quote is listed. He says, "To educational innovators, the school building, down to its last coat hook, was as powerful as model lessons, timetables, or systems of rewards and punishment." So this is quite interesting in that he already argues that the school building is actually as important as pedagogy, as important as what all the educators do in the building. So this is the starting point. But as I said, we are interested in the role of the spatial layout. So how does the layout come in? This is another quote by the architectural theory specialist, Robin Evans. So in his book, he wrote a series of essays, an essay called Figures, Doors and Passages. He said, "If anything is described by an architectural plan, it is the nature of human relationships." This is fascinating because if you ask architects what they think an architectural plan describes, they wouldn't say human relationships. They would say, oh, an architectural plan that describes walls and ceilings and where the windows are and where the openings go and maybe materials, etc. So we think of the architectural plan as an enabler of human relationships, as an enabler of social processes. Let me lead you just very briefly into the argument of Robin Evans, because it is a fascinating essay. So in this essay, he is comparing two time periods, the Renaissance and the 19th century. And he starts his investigations with this idea of paintings. So he looks at a Renaissance painting, and one of the examples he uses is the Madonna by Raphael, which you can see here on the slides, and a painting called Family Prayers by Samuel Butler from the 19th century. He describes the social relationships of people. In the Renaissance example, you can see in the painting the human figures, they are turned towards each other. They are touching, they are interacting quite closely. So he describes that society as one of, in his words, habitual gregariousness, passion, canality, and sociality. A society that is based on human encounter. In the 19th century, looking at that painting by Samuel Butler, he says, this is a society that is aimed at avoiding human contact. So all of the people are kept apart, they sit by themselves, no one is even looking at each other, people are not touching. He says this is reflected in the floor plans of the time. So if we go to some of the floor plans, you can now see that in the Renaissance example, a very famous architectural example is the Villa Rotonda by Andrea Palladio, something that all architecture students have to study. And you can see it's a system of interconnected rooms. So as you explore the building, you go from one room to another room to another room. And while you go through this system of interconnected rooms, you will automatically be in touch with occupation, with activities. So movement and the social processes going on in the building will be tightly interlinked. If you look at the example of Coleshill's house on the bottom right, you can see that this is a very different architectural example. So Robin Evans argues that in the 19th century, the idea of, or a little bit earlier, the idea of the corridor was born. Before that, there were no corridors in buildings. And the corridor now enables you to keep people apart. So people can be, for example, in here, if you can see my cursor, people can be in the saloon while people walking down the corridor will not be visible. And you can also see, quite interestingly, in this floor plan, all of these separate staircases. So there's these tiny staircases quite hidden away, for example, for servants or maids, so that the people in the house don't have to see all of these other people. So that's one way in which the layout becomes important. But we want to show you another way, a way by which we can quantify how interconnected rooms are and how those journeys of walking through rooms can be measured. So in this theory and idea, which we also refer to as space syntax, the syntax of space, this was pioneered at University College London by Bill Hillier and Julian Hansen. And the idea is that society and architectural layouts are very much intertwined. So here's a quote from the book, from one of their books, The Sociology of Space. I quote, "An architectural layout provides the material preconditions for the patterns of movement, encounter, and avoidance, which are the material realization, as well as sometimes the generator of social relations." So what they argue here is that it is not just that a layout reflects patterns of movement and encounter, but it can also be the generator of those patterns. So let's have a look how that works. If you think about space, space can be seen as a kind of continuous flowing, space is continuous and flowing. So in your daily life, if you leave the house in the morning and you pass through different spaces, you might go to the underground, you might go to work, you enter the office. All of those kind of spaces are obviously connected. But in order to analyze the degree of connection, we have to break them down into discrete individual elements. So how do we do that? Here are 3 examples of how we can break down space into elements. The first one on the left is an axial line model. So with axial lines, we focus on the linearity of space, how you can move through the space. So you can see those 2 examples of axial lines in this simple room with 3 openings. We can also look at the middle example, a so-called convex space, which looks at the boundedness, the kind of boundaries of a space. So in this example, we would focus on social aspects like co-presence or interaction. And we can also use a method that is based on human visibility. So if you look at this person here standing in the room, and you can see how through those openings, you get these lines of sight that extrude out of the space. And this kind of spiky figure of what you can see from a single kind of point in space, we would call that an isovist. So that is the kind of view shed of people. But now what we want to do is not just look at individual spaces and their occupation or how they are used, but we want to look at how they are connected. So let me show you an example. here's a floor plan of and this is an event space in London. It's also a showroom of a furniture company, but they host events in this kind of open kind of seminar space here at the center. So what I've drawn in here is a line that people coming into the space from the entrance would go. They would come in here, they would go to the reception desk and say, I'm here for this seminar. Then they would walk past here. This is a kitchen space, a little breakout space, and then walk here into the seminar. So if you do that walk, what would you see on the way? So first, this is your first isobist, forward-facing isobist. So you can already see that you see the totality of the room. So the isobist extends all the way into those kind of two deep corners of the room. As you move, the shape of your isobist changes, so you get glimpses of other kinds of spaces. As you stand in front of the reception, your isobist becomes a little bit smaller, a little bit more contained. They then send you to the seminar room. So as you walk past the kitchen, you turn, you enter the seminar space. And this is the perspective that you would have as the speaker of the seminar. So all of those different realities would have happened consecutively, one after the other, as you walked through that space. If we overlay them, we begin to get a little bit more of a collective picture of what you have been able to see while you walked in there. And you can see that certain areas have lots of overlays. So those are more visible from a lot of other locations, whereas there are some areas, for example, this group of seats here, that you have not seen yet so far. So it's more hidden. So now imagine we do this kind of isobist generating from every single kind of small location in the floor plan, and we systematically check any point location A to any other location B. How often do I have to look around the corner with these isobists so we get a shortest path? And with that shortest path, we can then calculate how integrated a location is or how segregated a location is in the overall system. Why does that matter? Well, with looking at layout configuration in this kind of way, we can model human occupancy and space usage behavior. So this is an example of a piece of work by colleagues of Bill Hillier. This was on the Tate Britain, so that's a major museum space in London. And you can see on the left-hand side, the spatial model based just on the configuration, on the visibility. So you can see that it's now colored in like a heat map. The warmer colors, red, orange, yellow, would show you more integrated spaces. So from those kind of red areas, you have very good overview, so you can see locally, but you can also reach other places very fast. So those are integrated. If you look at the more segregated spaces in blue, from those spaces you see very little, and you would have a hard time. You'd have to turn around quite a lot of times looking around the corners until you've seen everything. And then Hillier and colleagues observed movement traces of 100 visitors as they entered the museum. So this is the image here on the right with these squiggly yellow lines. And as you can see, those two match pretty well. There's a statistical correlation of around 0.66. So it's 66% of those movement patterns are explained purely by the spatial layout. So that is important because out of encounters, out of movement arises encounter, and out of encounter can arise other important aspects that we are interested in school buildings. So if we apply this idea to school buildings, in the course of this presentation, we want to lead you through 3 different aspects. The first aspect is school life. So we want to look at what kind of things happen in these school buildings in relation to its spatial configuration. Then we look at user perceptions, and those users can be teachers as well as students. And then finally, we want to look at managerial aspects. So what kind of things happen when the school management, the senior leadership team, the head teachers, how do they work with configuration, and also how they change the kind of movement flows sometimes. So let's have a look. I will start this off with a piece of research that I have undertaken myself before I then hand over to my 2 esteemed colleagues. So in this piece of work, this is a book chapter published in 2019. The chapter is called Corridors, Classrooms, Classification. And in this, I make an argument about how the school layout becomes important for pedagogy and social behaviours. In this chapter, I bring together various aspects of learning spaces. I've listed a few of those aspects, but if you're interested, please have a look and find that chapter online and you can read it. The first point is to think about the building as a third teacher. So this is very much in line of what I argued earlier using Thomas Marcus's idea of the building is important. The second element is corridors. Corridors are often underestimated in school buildings. So quite a lot we focus on classrooms because that's where teaching and learning happens, right? But in this chapter, I argue that the role of the corridors, not just as a transport space, but as a space that can host social interactions, that can host socialization, that hosts social behaviors, the corridor is much more important than only as a transport element. I discussed the history of school buildings very briefly. And what is interesting here, at least in the UK, school buildings moved from being very open in the 18th century with kind of big open halls where students were taught all together. Then in the 19th century, the closed classroom model became much more popular. So school buildings were closed. And then in the 20th century, a move towards new pedagogies and new school layouts started. So school buildings became more open again. So I want to look at this idea of how closed is closed or how open is open, and look at that in the case of actual school buildings and analyze their configurational choices. I will look briefly into the work of the educator Basil Bernstein and his idea of classification, of how can we look at, in his case, pedagogy, in our case, layouts, from a kind of classification point of view. So all in all, as I said, I'm interested in the affordance of layout choices for school life. The study is based on 5 different examples, and they are all listed here. The top 3 are school buildings in the UK, and the bottom 2 are school buildings in Denmark. I will go through each 5 in a second, but just to keep in mind, the 2 questions that I'm asking here is first, how free and undetermined is movement? So as you move, mostly through corridors, but also through open spaces, do students actually have a lot of choice of where they want to go? Or is movement very channeled and very kind of determined and strict. The second aspect I want to look at is how much do teaching learning activities overlap with movement flows. So this is the idea by Robin Evans. Do we have a building that fosters sociality, or do we have a building that fosters avoidance? So these are the two questions I want to address. The first example here is Chelsea Academy in the UK. And let me talk you through the slide layout quickly. So the first thing I'm doing is looking at the floor plan of a sample floor. So you can see that here in the center. I'm drawing an axial line map. So I'm drawing up those lines of potential movement, and I'm coloring them according to choice. So if I go from any random segment here to any other segment at the bottom of the plan, what's the shortest path? And which of those segments am I likely to pass through more often if I prefer straight lines of walking? So again, everything that's integrated, high levels of choice are colored in warm colors, segregated colored in cool colors. And you can see the distribution histogram up here. The other analytical method that I'm using is a so-called space type analysis. So I'm breaking down spaces by 4 different types. An A space will be a dead end. So a classroom, for example, that you walk in and it only has 1 opening. A B space has 2 openings, so it's a space of through movement. So you can go in one way and enter the other. A C space is a space that has a single loop. So for example, if you can see my cursor, this space down here is a single loop. So as you're standing here in this sports hall, there's 2 ways that you could access this corridor, either through this end or that end. So this is a C space, a single loop. And then we have D spaces that have more than 1 loop. And D spaces are spaces where you have lots of choice locally. So where you want to go next, you can decide quite freely. So those are the kind of configurational metrics that I want to look at in all of those examples. So if we look at this school here, what we can see is that there's those 2 corridors here. So it's a double corridor system. So that gives quite some choice of how to move from one space to another. But locally, you can see here, only 12% of these spaces, there is not that much choice. So it's a rather traditional school with corridors and classrooms. But as you can see in the photograph here, there's a lot of glass. So from the movement corridors, you get those glimpses into classrooms. So there's a little bit of overlap between movement and occupation. If we look at the social life in the school, and here's one quote from the book chapter, a particular concern of the pupils was the circulation system, since the school had to implement a one-way system to ease overcrowding between lessons. So here you get a glimpse of managerial interventions where those 2 narrow corridors got really overcrowded, and so the school introduced a one-way system to cope with that. You should know that in the UK, students leave their classrooms after every lesson, and all 1,000 students would move to a new classroom within 5 minutes. So there's a lot of movement that will happen in a very short point in time. And then here at the bottom of the slide is a quote from a student who said, "I like how you can look in the window to see if your teacher or friends are in the class." So you can see that there is some kind of overlap between movement and occupation. If we look at the second example, Kingsdale Foundation School, the school was refurbished. So initially you only had this kind of big loop with all of these kinds of buildings and those corridors kind of going through here. But then the school was refurbished, and the interior, those courtyards, then received this big roof. So they were roofed over, and those kind of additional spaces in the center were created. And that changed the school layout quite significantly to offer more choice. So what we have here, again, is that double corridor system. So you can see that choice is a bit more distributed here than it was in the previous example. And we also have a higher degree of local choice with more D and C type spaces. The principal of the school talked about the previous design before it received that new roof and those interior spaces added to the school, commented that it was an avalanche of bodies in the corridors breeding conflict. So it was really seen as problematic, similarly to Chelsea Academy, just too narrow corridors and lots of conflict. And the new design was meant to calm down and deinstitutionalize the space. You can see again that there's quite a few windows. So as you walk on those new corridors, again, you can get glimpses into the classrooms. So again, some overlap of what is happening as you move through the school. The third example is a much more open school building, UCL Academy, and in the UK. What you have here is, in some places, the corridor is completely dissolved. So you can see in this photograph here, a so-called super studio. So it's those three big studio spaces that can host up to 3 classrooms in parallel. And the internal corridor here is not separated from the super studio. And as a result here becomes the most integrated line of movement. You can see here in the distribution that this is reaching up much higher than in the previous examples, and also has a really big amount of D and C spaces, as you can see here, 30% of D spaces. So a lot more choice in the system. What happens when you add school life into the equation? We've got anecdotal evidence from conversations with teachers here that suggests that the exterior corridor, so there's a second corridor down here, and you can see that this is used less frequently than the interior one, despite teachers preferring students to take the exterior path. So the teachers always tell the students, can you please use this kind of pathway on the outer rim of the school? But the inner corridor just offers a lot more internal connections and is the shorter path. So a lot of students would prefer to take that. And this school building will feature much more in depth in the work of Dr. Fouad that you will see later. So this was an initial analysis, and then we decided to study it further. The Orestat Gymnasium in Denmark is, again, a very open school building. You can see this grand staircase in the photograph in the center that loops itself up through the spaces, and as such attracts a lot of the kind of movement paths around here. So there is not a lot of local choice, because once you're in the system, you are confined to those kind of central corridors, but there's a lot of overlap between all of the teaching activities and movement. And this is also what you can see in school life reflected. So the principal has said it is a building that fits the pedagogy we're aiming for and that forces us to work differently. So that's interesting to kind of think about those two in tandem. What kind of pedagogy do we need for what kind of building structure? And then from one of the teachers, a comment, I think it is so cool when you walk around that you can see your co-workers. Oh, someone is teaching there. What is he or she doing? Then you can stand there and watch and think, ah, okay, that is another way. I could also have done it like that. So there's kind of learning happening between the teachers on how to teach. And the final example, Hellerup School in Denmark, is a very open school. Yet again, as you can see from the photograph, there's a lot of local choice in the system. So you can see all of those loops in the layout here, reflected in this relatively high figure of these spaces, but not quite so much global choice in the system, but again, a lot of overlap. And again, managerial aspects come in here. So here's a quote from one of the teachers. We as teachers and the children create small, intimate spaces with inventory on a daily basis. We use mobile partition walls to eliminate visual and audio-based noise. It is helpful for the children, especially the younger children or the not so integrated children, to have a sensation of, this is us, this is where we are. It is about creating a sense of joint ownership. So what you see here is a school building that by its layout is very open and allows a lot of overlap. But then the teachers kind of close that off in daily activities, at least to some degree, to create more intimate teaching spaces. So in summary, if we put those 5 schools on this 2x2 matrix, on the x-axis here, you have movement flows. So is there lots of choice, or is movement more predetermined? And on the y-axis here, you have the overlap between movement and occupation. So you can see that the more traditional school buildings are in that corner of strong and strong classification. So movement is more predetermined and activities are a little bit more separated, but there's differences between the two. So Kingsdale is moving a little bit more towards the weaker end of the scale, while Chelsea Academy is more strongly classified in both directions. And then as we move into the more weakly, strongly weak or strong classified system of these open schools, you can see that they excel on different aspects of openness. So for example, UCL Academy really excels on choice, whereas Hellerup School really excels on this overlap, but that was limited a little bit by managerial action. Orestad has very strong overlap, but is less integrated in terms of choice. So what this allows us to do, in summary, is it offers us an opportunity to look at school buildings in a quite detailed, nuanced way, to not just say a school is closed or open and we have these fixed pre-assumptions of how this would work, but rather we can look at the details and appreciate what exactly the spatial layout will do to the users and getting glimpses into school life. With this, I would hand you over to my colleague, Dr. Chrystala Psathiti, who is going to share her work looking at school buildings in Cyprus in a much more detailed way. So over to you, Chrystala.
Thank you, Kerstin, for the introduction. For my part, I will be presenting part of my PhD research titled Assessing Educational Environments, a Temporal Sociospatial Approach to Lower Secondary School Buildings in Cyprus. And as you can see, as opposed to all the examples that we have seen earlier, is that in Cyprus, we have open air schools. They're not closed. We don't have closed outdoors, but we have various functional units distributed within the plot and some covered corridors. So this is a huge difference between the two types that is the first step to understand the study overall. Next slide, please. The school buildings in Cyprus, I studied them through those 5 different periods. The period that made the most important, the most influence, let's say, it was the 1960s, the independence period of Cyprus, where the minimalistic aesthetics, the open air structure, the functional dispersal have been firstly introduced. Since 2000, the technical department of the Ministry of Education and Culture has assigned the design of school buildings to various independent architects based on particular design guidelines that the ministry provides. Next slide, please. Based on the fact that after 2000, we have 10 secondary school buildings built in Cyprus, I thought this offers a good common base, since they have been designed with the same design guidelines, but from various architects. As you can see on the table, the 10 buildings differ significantly as regards the number of students, teachers, their location, or the density of the area that they have around. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, all of these schools have been designed based on particular design guidelines. Here, I just tried to visualize some of the most important guidelines that have been provided by the ministry, and just I capture slightly the relationships between the spaces that are proposed there. So, for example, they propose the sports outdoor area to be related to the sports indoor area and directly connected to the parking and slightly on the one part of the plot. So I'm just mentioning this because it will make sense afterwards. Next slide, please. So as you see here from the functional allocation, the dark gray area is the sports area. So all of the architects, without even collaborating, they decided to put the sports area on the one part of the plot. This served in the purpose of the ministry to have different access, to be operable after school hours. And that's why all of the architects made the same decision. Equally important, as you see in the middle of the schools, there are these light blue color areas that are the courtyards. So all of the schools are defined to a certain extent by the courtyards. Some schools have one central courtyard, such as the school 1, while other schools have more than one courtyards. They have smaller courtyards and functional stripes, and that are associated with circulation lines. If we could move forward, as you can see here on the composite assemblies of the built form, we have, let's say, two different building types, school building types in Cyprus. We have the courtyard-based schools that are defined by this single courtyard in the middle of the school, but again, completely separated from the sports area. And we have the hierarchical-based schools that are defined by various smaller courtyards and linear circulation systems. Next slide, please. This research, in order to understand more in-depth the spatial configuration, user perception, and school life, studies two schools into more depth. So here you can see the analysis that you have seen earlier from Kerstin is again a segment analysis, and we are studying here the choice metric. So with the red areas, we're showing the areas that offer more movement potentials, are more integrated, and are more likely to be selected as a path, as opposed to blue areas that are more segregated and less likely to be selected. So by comparing the two schools, we can see that both schools have in the middle a red area, a very integrated area in the middle. The main movement corridor, let's say, is depicted by the analysis. In the case of the school 2, the main movement corridor is depicted more, it's more red because the two images are comparable. But what is common also in those two examples is that the sports area that is on the left side of the plots is really, really segregated. So very, very distant from the main school unit, both functionally and behavior, let's say, wise. So having said that, let's move to the next slide, please. We would like you now to answer for us which of the two schools do you think foster a stronger school community based on what you have seen, at least for now. So if Ivan can take over just to circulate through this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dear participants, could you please scan the QR code with your camera, and you will be followed by the link. Otherwise, you can put the code on the website www.onmenti.com, and then you can just do that. Just choose the option you prefer more, and let us see how many people are able to scan the code. And then our speakers will show the results on the screen. Yeah, if you scan the QR code, you see two options, and you are asked which of the examples you think supports more strongly built school community. Please choose one of the special layouts, and just up to you. What's your opinion? And then we will see the results.
So I'm the master of the Menti here, and I can see the first few votes coming in. But I would wait a little bit longer for more people to make their choices before we're going to reveal.
Yeah, the easiest way would be just to scan the QR code with your camera and then choose one option. If not, just enter the website, enter the code, and make the same choice.
Okay, votes are still coming in, but maybe I'll switch over to some of the results right now. You can still keep voting. So here we have, what do I do now? Okay. So at the moment, school 2 is in the lead, 23 votes for school 2, showing a stronger school community.
Do you want to go? Oh no, we still have votes.
Still votes coming.
Yeah. I think we've got a trend. We have almost double number of people voting for school 2.
But there are some school 1 fans. Do you want to move on, Chrystala?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So I won't answer which one, but we will find out, just to keep you more excited until the end. So I will give you now more insights for the school life of those 2 schools in order to be able to see whether your projections are right or wrong. So let's go to the second slide, to the next slide. One of the things that the study examined also was students' movement. Here you can see movement traces, the blue lines, that I traced them during the students' transfers from one class to the other. So what the analysis has shown is that the movement depends both on the spatial configuration and the analysis we've seen earlier, but also on the functional location of the school. For example, here you can see the different colors of the functions. That students move from a special classroom to a general classroom, and in the first school they pass through the school courtyard primarily, while on the second school, on the school 2, they pass through this very reddish corridor that we saw earlier. So we can understand that this reveals the role of attractors in schools and the configuration in use as termed by Dr. Saylor in a different study. Next slide, please. Also, the importance of attractors for movement traces has been also revealed by studying the entrances to the school. So I followed students entering the schools and trace the paths. Here you can see that school 1 has just solely 1 entrance, while school 2 has 3 different entrances. This means that the school 1 releases students from a singular location. That's why we have very densely populated the area of the entrance, as opposed to the school 2 that the users are splitted across those 3 entrances. But again, we can see the role of spatial configuration, because those main movement corridors that we saw earlier on the analysis are again selected by the students as their route towards where their class or where they want to hang out until they start their lesson. Next slide, please. However, movement is not always programmed, as I explained earlier. It's also unprogrammed and happens during breaks. So I also studied movement in schools during their free time, their break time. In this case, I studied them with a different method. It's called snapshot, and it's like we're taking a photograph of the area, and we're tracing the location of the students or the moving individuals, let's say, in the area. As we can see, the movement happens almost everywhere in both schools. What is very, very obvious, however, is that in school 2, we have very, very dense movement in the middle of the school, in the very integrated area of the main corridor. And this is normal and expected, because we have a movement corridor with such a high level of choice in that particular school. In school 1, we have users moving around in all the spaces of the school, in courtyards, corridors, since the corridors are actually extended through the courtyards, are not very, very defined as in the case of school 2. Next slide, please. What was very interesting by studying the movement distribution during breaks, it was that I realized that none of the users, none of the students used the sports area. This is very strange because they were free to go wherever they wanted, but in fact they weren't so free. Both principals and both head teachers decided to eliminate the outdoor area, and it's here where the managerial aspects overlap with the spatial potential that is given by the schools. Because, as we saw on the analysis, those areas were particularly segregated, the school principals decided to limit the zone of operation for students in order to be able to control them. And this is expected, right? We can assume if we were in their position, we could do the same, because they couldn't control the distribution of the students in such a segregated areas. So here with the gray fill, you can see the zone of operation that was allowed to students to use. Next slide, please. Therefore, this particular gesture by the head teachers defined not only the movement, but also the places for interaction or for any other activity that will the students and teachers will do in the school during breaks. Here I'm placing the with the yellow dots the interacting individuals. So in the locations that we saw, either students interacting with other students or teachers interacting with students. With the red color on the table below, you can see that in school 1, interaction happens primarily within the courtyards, as opposed to school 2, where we have interactions between students primarily in the circulation areas. And this is the significant difference between the two schools. Also, the teacher-student interaction in school 1 happens in more than one spaces. For example, happens in circulation, courtyards, and general outdoor areas. While in school 2, we have interaction between student and teachers only in the circulation areas. Next slide, please. And going one step further, in order to understand the school community better, I studied the synchronic co-presence of individuals in the schools. By synchronic co-presence, I mean how many students or teacher and teachers, how many school users are located in the same functional area at the same time. So if you see below the table with the red colors, you can see that the number of school users interacting in circulation, courtyard, and outdoors areas are higher in the case of school 1 for courtyard and outdoors, while in school 2 we have higher synchronic presence in the circulation areas. So if we say it more simply, we have in school 1, we have interaction and synchronic presence almost everywhere in the school. While in school 2, we have interaction and synchronic presence of users primarily within the main circulation unit. So let's move to the next slide. And that's why we had students from school 1 saying, we are all family here. We know everyone and we all hang out together. During the 1st grade, there have been some cliques, but we have gradually all become friends. So here we can see students discussing, let's say, expressing about the schools with more warm and personal language, as opposed to more operational and more distant language that students from school 2 used when I asked them, what do you like about your school? What do you think about your school? Etc. Let's move forward. And going one step further, we can understand that to have this reality, both the spatial configuration and the managerial aspects played a significant role. For example, in the case of school 1, the managerial decision of how to eliminate the outdoor area created a structure, an organized outdoor area, which is in association with the built spaces of the school and the courtyards, the green area that bounces all the areas of the school together. As opposed to the outdoor area of school 2, which is broader, loosely defined, and particularly fragmented. So in this case, the head teacher decided again to eliminate the outdoor area, but not that precise and organized in relation to the built spaces as in the case of school 1. Let's move forward. And therefore, going back to your guessings and the Mentimeter, I would argue that it's the school 1 that offers a more stronger school community, because it has permanent forms of co-presence in space, as we saw with the interacting individuals and the presence of individuals in the main courtyards. We have bigger and more frequent interactive groups. We have higher student interaction with teachers. We have more personal discussion with their teachers, and social labeling, for example, whether they're female or male or from a different ethnicity, does not have a spatial reinforcement, as opposed to school 2, where we have a more temporal form of co-presence. Why is temporal? Because it happens primarily in the main movement corridor. It happens by means of movement and not by means of occupation. In school 2, we have smaller and less frequent interactive groups, who have less student interaction with teachers, who have more operational discussion with teachers, and in fact, social labeling in this school has a spatial reinforcement. And in that school, we have a lot of students from various ethnicities. So it was very a very striking conclusion that the different ethnicities selected a different area to occupy in the school. And more importantly, when I was there for so many days, I figured a student sitting alone throughout all the breaks of the school. No one realized that that student sit alone for the whole period. But indeed, the spatial configuration offered that possibility for him. Next slide, please. So going one step further, those different aspects are also apparent on user perceptions. Let's go forward. In particular, I studied students' positive attitudes towards school and the role of classroom location. By analyzing simultaneously the spatial layout, the location of their classrooms, and students' perceptions, I realized that how integrated the classroom, how visually integrated the classroom is, and among other parameters, such as how often students meet their friends, how well they think that they go to the school, their gender as well. All those factors can explain to a great extent, to 41% of student answers, how positive they believe that they find their school, how positive their attitudes towards the school are. So by having said that, it's important for managers in education and school principals to understand that by deciding who they place where, they're to a small extent, they're also defining how positive or negative their attitudes will be towards school. And one last investigation, let's move forward. It was about teachers' perception and teachers' sense of control and supervision. In this investigation, I realized that both the spatial configuration, meaning the movement potentials that are offered by the school, and the school interface, or the interface of the school perimeter to with the street, could explain by 51% a teacher's sense of control and supervision. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So all of this, I think, lead to a great extent to various aspects that include managerial decisions. And let's move forward. From macro scale to micro scale. My analysis showed that school design guidelines define to a great extent school building types. And in turn, design decisions by architects define to a great extent the spatial layout of the school. And lastly, the school users, by having this particular spatial layout, they make some particular social actions. They enforce rules, they make decisions, and those decisions and rules and transspatial aspects define sociospatial realities. So I think this is my closing remark, and I head over to my colleague, Dr. Fouad.
Thank you, Dr. Psathiti, and thank you, Dr. Kerstin. Just a quick question before I start to the moderator, Ivan. How much more time do we have so I can try to readjust? Hello?
Yeah, no worries. We do have enough time, as much time as you need. So we will do everything according to your timeline.
Okay, thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for me. Good afternoon to you, time difference. So I will be continuing along what Dr. Saylor and Dr. Chrystala Psathiti has been discussing in terms of showing some of the school social life and then presenting how different perceptions of the teacher and the student vary, and then showing the management or the managerial aspects. But before we start that, I just want to go back a bit to the title of our presentation, where we say school buildings scrutinizing layouts. This word is very important, at least for me or for all of us, because we do a scrutiny. We try to understand and examine what happens in space in details to understand not just what the architect is proposing or the management is saying, but also what the students are doing. So if we take a simple example of a tree and we try to scrutinize a tree to see what does it afford. When we say the word affordance, as Kerstin or Dr. Saylor has mentioned, it is what the space can accommodate in terms of actions and activities. And it was introduced by James Gibson in 1979. So back to my tree, I would perceive a tree maybe as a source of wood, as a material. Some people would use it as a shading device to sit. Some people would write on the tree as a piece of paper. But other organisms, they see the tree as food. So for them, the ants or the termites, they eat the tree, which is a very different type of affordance. Some animals, like squirrels, they live in the tree, that's their home. And other birds, for example, they have a nest on the tree. So they use the tree as their site to build their home. So all these different affordances are all accommodated, or these possibilities are accommodated in the tree. Next slide, please. So if we try to think in this way, looking at 11 different schools, which are my case studies. By the way, I'm only focusing today on 2, but we have 11 case studies. And what is the first step I take is to look in deep, to scrutinize these schools, to see what does the spatial configuration, as in how spaces are connected or disconnected, as in integrated or segregated, what does that mean to the students? So next slide, please. So, as I said, I have 2 main schools in this study, school A1 across the screen on the top and school B1 on the bottom. The biggest difference you can see between both, and Dr. Saylor has hinted that in her presentation, where spaces in A1, which is technically UCL Academy, the spaces are open. The learning spaces connect to the corridor, and there is a very strong integrated or connected middle corridor in the middle. The red part you can see on the screen. School B1 is very different. Why? Because it is the conventional or the typical 2 wings connected by 1 corridor in between. All the spaces are closed. If you're walking down the corridor, you cannot see anything. Next, please. So let's have similar to what we did with Dr. Psathiti. Let's do this exercise on mentimeter.com, use this code or the QR code, and let's see which school, A1 or B1, would afford or accommodate or have the potential for more informal learning activities. When I say informal learning activities, by the way, I mean students taking initiative to sit down individually or in groups in order to do some activities like as simple as talking or revising, doing an exercise, studying, while all of this happening being initiated by the students, not initiated by the teachers. So maybe Dr. Saylor can tell us some sneak peeks about the answers.
Yes, there's 2 votes so far, so I think we need a little bit more time for people to...
Come on, people, vote, please.
Yeah, we're like these, you know, in a music contest.
Yeah.
It's time for you to vote.
There are prizes at the end if you vote.
So yes, I would just give some more time for people to go to Menti again, and to allow for people to make their guesses, and then I can share results.
Yeah. Again, when I say informal learning activities, I mean that students initiate an activity, sit together to study or talk or revise for an exam outside the typical class time. So mainly during lunch break, morning break, between the classes, and so on.
Okay, we've got around 21 people have voted so far, so I would give it a little bit more time for everyone to go to Menti and make their choices. Okay, let me swap my screen to here.
Okay, this is actually good news because I know Dr. Psathiti has made you wait till the end to know the answer, but I'm not going to make you wait. Yes, school A1 with the open plan learning spaces offers more potential for informal learning, and this is proven or shown in data that I'm going to show you in just a few seconds. So whenever we're going to go back, oh, come on, B1 is going up even after I said the answer. That's not good. That's not a good sign, but it's fine.
It must be the lag. People must
Yeah.
have pressed before. Should we go back to presentation then?
Yes, please.
And thank you everyone for watching.
So now to talk about the school life in A1 and B1, I will start with the next slide, please, to show some pictures. Here you see again on the top school A1 how students use the space, this open space that connects to the corridor. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to take pictures of students in B1, but you can imagine them sitting on these like rows and columns of desks, everyone sitting in pairs or individually doing the activities. They have no connection to whatever is happening in the corridor. Next, please. So during the lunch break, which is the big break in school A1, if you go to the other school, you will not find inside the building students doing any activities. But if you stay in A1 in the lunch break inside the building, not in the playground, you would see a diversity of activities happening in the corridors, in the open plan learning spaces, and in the classrooms. This could be interactions, studying, revising, even playing chess or some board games, dancing, praying, relaxing, or even misbehaving. And this all take place inside the building during lunch break in various spaces, as I mentioned. If we go to the next slide, we ask the big question: are these activities related to the spatial configuration, or are they related to how connected or disconnected spaces are? The answer is yes. So one of my biggest findings in my life, not just in this research, is that there is a significant correlation between the type of activity that happens and how connected or disconnected the space is, which I measured using visual mean depth. I think Dr. Saylor gave you a bit of introduction about how red spaces are more connected, and as it goes down in the spectrum, they are less connected. So if you look at the graph on the downside of the screen, you can see that students are misbehaving in the highest number, 6.1, which is the most detached or disconnected or segregated spaces, but they are relatively more integrated or more connected when they are talking, interacting together. You would see some interesting activities like praying or dancing, where students also want to hide away, not to be very visible in front of other students or teachers. That's why they are relatively more segregated and so on. So this spread of activity is not randomized, but it follows a certain spatial configuration pattern. Next, please. And now I'm going to take this slide and talk about the student perceptions and teachers' perception. Next, please. So we're staying with the same flow plan, same school, same time, almost same students. But now we try to see this relationship between the teacher and the student. So the red triangles are the teachers standing in the corridors or inside the spaces. And as Dr. Saylor has referred to isoverists, or if a teacher is standing, what are they seeing in terms of visibility angle? So you can see on your left-hand side, the Western Open Studio, the furniture where the students are sitting on doesn't have a high back. So if a teacher is standing, they can see the whole open plan learning space. So they don't mind whatever students are doing, and they almost allow every student to be in that area. If you go to the eastern side, to the far east or the middle super studio, you would see that the back of the furniture is a bit high. So if you're sitting inside this enclosure sofa, or they call it forum space, you're not very visible from the corridor. So guess what happens? The teachers do not allow every student to sit there. Depends on your behavior. If you know that, if they know you have a good record of not misbehaving, you're allowed to be around the spaces. If you are a naughty student, they push you to the other end and they do not allow you to be there. But you can see the stars on the plan. These are preferred spaces for students. And guess what? They are always a bit hidden. If we go to the next slide, please. Now I want to take you out of this enclosed building to see what's happening in the playground. So we're trying to see again how teachers and students perceive spaces versus the students' preferences. So on the top row, you see the playground of school A1 over 2 levels, so level 1 and level 2. On the bottom, you see the playground of school B1. What I really want to show in this slide is these numbers, like in red, if you can see them, 35, 48, and 36. The area marked as the backside of the playground. Yes, exactly. So for the teachers or for the management, this is the backside of the school. Also for the architect, this is the backside of the school. So they assume it's not that popular, but if you count the number of students passing in 5 minutes, only on average in 5 minutes, it is these numbers, 48, 35, and 36. It tells you that this area is popular, not as the teachers perceive it to be the backside. In B1, we have a similar case where the corridor on the far right side, it meant, yes, this one, where the number of students passing in 5 minutes is 60. This is also the back corridor perceived by the architect and the teachers to be the back corridor. And actually, the teachers prefer if the students take the other front route, that is AY4, AY3. Yet, you don't see that much of a difference between both of them. Again, teachers perceiving a space that does not match the preferences of the student. Next, please. So if we take this idea of the mismatch between the teacher's perceptions and the student preferences and try to see what activities happen in space. So why is this backside very popular in school A1? You would find out from this scrutiny, this backside is used for actually playing football. So you have some students using the main playground. Why? Because they are very confident, they are very skilled in football, so they are not afraid of being seen by other students. But there's a lot of other students who are not that good in playing football, and they still want to play football. So they go to the backside, and the teachers allow that. There is no regulations on where you can play. So they go to the backside, which was designed as a social area. And accordingly, all the other students who do not want to be hit by a ball, they move away from the social space. This is very different to what happens in school B1. Why? Because in B1, they allocate where activities can happen. So you're not allowed to play football outside the pitches. You have to go to the pitches. That's why functionalities and activities somehow match, unlike A1. I just have to mention that also students are very aware about the spatial configuration. So they have a sense of, am I being seen or not seen? And this reflects on if you're eating in the playground, which is not allowed in A1. Why? Because you should be eating in the dining area. You would find that they do this in the most segregated or disconnected or not visible spaces. Another point that I really appreciate in School A1, which shows clearly the mismatch between functionalities and activities, the area on level 2 marked number 9 and says outdoor gym. Yes, this area. Technically, this is a gym area. So yes, it has sports, the mauve dots, yet you can also see a lot of pink dots. And what are the pink dots? These are students chilling, relaxing, doing nothing. Why? Because it has a very soft ground. So students just sit on it and enjoy their time not doing any sports. So technically, you have students not doing any sports in the gym area and students playing football in the backside, which was a social space. And it shows you clearly that if we have done some spatial analysis during the design time, maybe we could have changed a bit how we perceive spaces. Next, please. Okay, now we're moving to the managerial aspects. So how these spaces are reconfigured by the management. Next, please. So you remember one of my first slides where I showed School A1 being open, students doing different activities during the lunch break. Guess what? That doesn't happen when there is a class. Dr. Saylor has hinted to how this school has 2 corridors, internal and external, and that the students, yes, by research and by numbers, they prefer the inside corridor. So how does the school respond during the class time when they want discipline, they don't want noises? They close down the entrances of the inside corridors. So you can see these X's with a red circle. They close down technically the gates where you can get in. So they change this open plan learning space into a typical classroom. They can even have partitions to separate the space into a typical classroom. And they activate the outer corridor for students to get into their classes. So you can see that the spatial config is reconfigured. It's almost a new school when classes are happening. What's happening on the other school in B1? Well, technically it was a closed plan in the first place, closed corridors. The school doesn't need to change anything. If you keep it the way it's designed, it operates the way they want it. Next, please. Moving from, so we mentioned the corridors and the open plan learning spaces. We mentioned the playground. Now we're looking at the library. On the left-hand side, you can see A1, and this library is a bit disconnected than library B1. Even you can see more green, yellow colors, but on the other side, you see more red. Does that impact how the library is being used? To some extent. How we can see this in the next slide, please. You can see that, okay, well, although the library of A1 is a bit disconnected, there are no much regulations by the librarian. Students can do whatever they want, and they make use of the pockets in between the shelves. So you have these rectangular shelves, and there are pockets in between, which are not visible to the teacher. And students feel free to sit, relax, talk, interact, read a book, and do whatever they want. Dr. Saylor has pointed out what is an isophist, and I repeat, it's like if you're sitting somewhere or standing, what you see. So the gray area on both images shows you what the librarian can see. So in the areas that are white, in A1, as I said, students do whatever they want. In the areas that are white, in B1, guess what happens? The librarian enforces strong regulations. You are not allowed to sit in this area unless you are accompanied by a teacher to do a tutorial. So yes, exactly this top right pocket. So they are again reconfiguring the space to fit what they want and to change the original design. So you can clearly see, yes, there is more students in B1, technically because this is situated along a very busy corridor, as you will see in the next slide, please. Whereas in A1, the library is a bit segregated. So actually students go there if they need the library. But if we look at what's happening here in B1, on the very far left-hand side, you can see two corridors from the two wings that merge into the corridor on the right-hand side of the library, the one highlighted in yellow. So this corridor is the intersection between the two wings of the school. So if you're going down or moving between wings, you have to pass by the library. You can even see in the picture that the library is designed to be an open space, like even the wall is shorter and you can see what's happening inside by just walking in the corridor. Guess what? The teachers and the management do not want this corridor to be busy or noisy, so they put these signs. This area is monitored by CCTV. If you are caught in this area, you are not going to like you're gonna have a penalty or something. So they are trying to force the students away from this area. How do the students respond? If you see again along the yellow part of the corridor, the red dots. The red dots are situated in two different boxes. The orange box is an area where the students put their bags. So you can imagine how lazy the students become to stand and put the bag for so long because they want to interact and talk. Because as you see, once they enter the library space, you can see that the dots, which are orange, students moving and interacting, change into green. They have to do an activity. The librarian, if they see you not doing an activity in the library, you will be pushed out. So this transition from outside to the inside is the only hope of interacting. Or you could have a locker on the mauve rectangle also along this corridor, and this is your alibi. So you would stand by the locker, chat, talk, even snack a sandwich. And if a teacher passes, you pretend you're using the locker. So the students are even, because the space is triggering them to stay there. It's very dense, very connected to the library where most of their friends are. They want to stay there. Teachers tell them no. They respond by having an alibi. Next, please. Moving from the library to talking finally about the dining spaces, I don't want to go into much details, but I just want to show you that here it is inverted. There are more regulations in A1 in the dining areas than in B1. Why is that? Because the school allocates a dining space to every student. So let's say me, Zaky, you are going to be eating in dining A. I cannot go to dining B to get my food. I have to go to dining A. Accordingly, if my friend is eating in dining B, we have to finish eating quickly and we meet outside the dining. So the dining space is not a social space. This is very different in B1. Why? Because the dining space is almost the only indoor space where you're allowed to talk. So every activity can happen in the dining space with consent from the teachers. So it's much busier with eating plus other activities. The only dining space in A1 that has activities not eating is the far east dining space on level 2, the one highlighted on the right. Why is this happening? Because teachers tell some students, if you need to revise before your exam, go to dining dining, I think D, or the one on level 2, which is a bit segregated and you can use the space to study. As students sit to study, other students are situated to the very far end of this dining space, next to the red room, and they are actually misbehaving. Why is that happening? Because unlike all the other dining spaces, the teacher's room, highlighted in red, has an opaque, it's not transparent. So the teachers do not see what's happening next door to them. So students can go to study, but they can also go to misbehave and so on. So you can see the different patterns of activities that emerge from changing the managerial aspect. And this brings me to the next slide, which is, again, one of my happiest findings in life. So technically, this graph on the, let's explain it a bit. On the x-axis, you see the time interval, so almost the schedule of the day in the two schools. On the y-axis, you see the configuration, as in how connected or disconnected the space is. The highlighted boxes are the lunch break. On the left-hand side, you see school A1. Can you see this gradient from dark brown to the other end of brown, like the light brown? What's happening here? Movement or activities and movement revert to the natural way, what we call as the natural movement. So more students are located in the more connected spaces, so they are doing more activities in the more connected spaces, and less students are located in the less connected spaces. And this is a gradient from the dark brown, as in more dense number of students, to the less dark or lighter brown, less number of students. On the other side, what is happening in B1? It's very different. This gradient is not, it's not a gradient in the first place. It is randomized colors. Why? Because we have allocation of activities and movements in certain areas. So that doesn't match the natural way people would be moving. Which brings us to the next slide, almost my concluding slide. So if we put on the x-axis now the influence of the environment, mainly from the spatial configuration or from how connected or disconnected spaces are, this is my x-axis. On the y-axis, I put on regulations. We can have almost 4 sections. First, on the left-hand side, you have a rich landscape of affordances. What do I mean by that? I mean that the configuration or space, the way it is laid out, offers opportunities or possibilities for certain activities. And if the regulations are easy, so the school is not putting too much pressure or strict enforcement of rules on the students, students can select to do activities according to whatever they want. And this is what happens, for example, in the library A1. If we go to a more stricter environment, you can see how the classes of B1 during lunch break are completely empty. Why are they empty? Because there's strong regulations, you cannot be there, and the space is not offering, not demanding that you act upon it. Let's go to the other side, the right side of the graph. You see now affordances that command to be acted upon. What does that mean? If you have a doorknob, it pushes you or triggers you to twist it. If you have an open plan learning space, it triggers you to walk into it from the corridor, to talk to the students, to sit down, to use the nice furniture, the sofas, and so on. So there's an element of trigger to the student. When this happens with less regulations, with easy environment, as in A1, the open plan learning spaces during lunch break, only lunch break, you can see the diverse activities that I have started with at the beginning of my part. But what happens when you have a very strict environment, but you also have affordances that trigger you or command you to act upon it? You see what happens in the next to the library in B1. So technically, you have a space that triggers you to stay in, to talk, to move along it, but the management is restricting you. So students act against the design, against the regulations to follow the design. And this is very interesting to see this almost dichotomy between managerial aspects and what happens influenced by space. And I think this was the end of my part. I will hand back to Dr. Saylor for the final notes, and then we will have the Q&As. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of my colleagues, Dr. Psathiti and Dr. Fouad, for fascinating insights into their very, very detailed investigations into school buildings and behaviours. I don't want to take much more time and rather spend time with your questions. But just by way of a summary, we've looked at these 3 aspects of school life, user perceptions, and managerial aspects, and how all three of those are interlinked with spatial configuration in a variety of ways. So just to recap, it's not that spatial configuration is a kind of determinant of behavior. It's not like, you know, there's a layout and you have to use it in one particular way. So the idea of affordances that Dr. Fouad brought in, I think is really helpful here, but also how we can see some regularities in how certain configurations are more likely to be used in certain ways. And all three of those are obviously interrelated. So we've tried to kind of pull them apart to some degree to kind of say, this is school life, this is user perceptions, and over there we've got the managerial aspects. But of course, in true life, they're all, you know, kind of interlinked and depend on each other. As we move into the Q&A, and we're very happy to take any questions you might have, but just to kind of spark some ideas or spark some thoughts for discussion on school life, really a question that we could explore is, what forms of school life are actually desirable? What do we want users to be doing in school? Do we think of school as a, you know, just a place for learning? Or is this a place where we want students to stay, for example, and use as a socialization space? On user perceptions, how important do we actually think user well-being is? Or do we only care for the end results, how good they are in exams? On the managerial aspects, how strong should management influence be actually? And the final question on spatial configuration, because we are aware that in Kazakhstan you have more closed classroom systems, but really just open up the idea of, would more open schools actually work in a Kazakh context? And the final point for you to kind of think about and take away is that interrelationship between pedagogy and the school building. So if the pedagogy and the school building are in line, if they both try to achieve the same kind of thing, it might be easier to manage the school, but we have also seen plenty of examples where those kind of go against, where the school building tries to achieve one thing, and then the school management is trying to achieve another. So with those thoughts, I would stop sharing screen. I can share later back again if there's a particular slide you want me to go back to.